It is a great pleasure and honor for the Ilia State University I represent to host today's event. Just a few words about our speaker. Elis is a professor at New York University. She was president of the American Anthropological Association, author of 6 books and many articles in cultural anthropology and gender studies, editor or co-editor many collections of papers, founder editor of the journal, public journal of the American Anthropological Association, Open Anthropology, editor of the public journal North American Dialogue. She was international scholar of Open Society Institute, affiliated with the Gender Studies Center at Tbilisi State University, co-editor of the collection of papers, Gender in Georgia, Feminist Perspective on Culture, History and Nation in the South Caucasus, organizer of several international colloquiums and workshops. So I will not take up any more of your time and will give the floor to our guest. Please.
Thank you so much. I am so deeply honored to be here and to receive this wonderful honor from you and from the university. And I want to thank my wonderful friend Tamara for arranging everything. And I have so many friends in the audience that I'm so thrilled. I won't name everybody, but I just want to say thank you so much also to Ilia State University, to ARISC, for arranging to get me here in the first place. So it's really a thrill, and I'm delighted to present this public lecture this evening. So thank you very, very much. So as you can see from the slide, the title of my presentation this evening is In Dark Times. I take the opportunity of this talk to reflect on this moment of being in the world and in the academy, by which I mean that I, as an anthropologist and feminist scholar, standing without fixity pressed against the world, will look to lift the protective cotton wool to peek at some real things. The old-fashioned imagery I invoke of the cotton wool is purposeful. It comes from a book of Virginia Woolf's autobiographical writings titled Moments of Being. I choose to start with Woolf, the 20th century British novelist and essayist, because her work was an influence, helping bring me to the disciplines of anthropology and gender studies in the first place. More than that, to invoke ancestors from any discipline is to claim their relevance to all fields of study and thus encourage the widened and widening view that often loses out to rigidity and the comfortable insularity of the silo. Woolf's editor, Jean Schulkind, describes moments of being as, and I quote, experiences on a purely sensual level. The meaning unfolds after the experience. For Woolf, a moment of being comes with a shock, a sledgehammer blow. It is followed by the need to explain it. Understanding comes thereafter. It is or will become a revelation. To speak of revelation in the profane sense of disclosure or illumination, bringing something to light out of darkness, might go without saying. So central is it to the scholarly endeavors of some social science fields and the humanities. For a moment, I'd like to stick with the darkness. No doubt these are dark times, and I shall repeat that I am speaking from the view of the United States. Speaking to anthropologists, Sherry Ortner has noted The dark times have led us to focus on the harsh dimensions of social life. How could it not? How could we not? After all, it is the dark times, the disorder and the hunger, the massacres and the slaughterers, the political catastrophes and moral disasters, to use philosopher Hannah Arendt's words, that bring outrage and sometimes despair, and that beg to be identified, studied, revealed, and understood. Of course, the dark times, in the broadest sense, are not new, as Arendt observed. Darkness comes, she argued, when light is extinguished. And light is extinguished by the cover-ups, the cotton wool of purposeful obfuscation and pointless trivia that make it almost impossible for people to see what is going on. She observed, and I quote, "When we think of dark times and of people living and moving in them, we have to take this camouflage emanating from and spread by the establishment or the system into account. Nothing of this is new either," Arendt remarked over a half-century ago. I came to anthropology, the study of humankind in all its aspects, to help me understand the dark times in New York that I began observing as a Brooklyn school teacher in the 1970s. The subjective experiences of the long dark times of poverty in America were never only about depression and hopelessness, though that was there too, but about the human capacity to adopt, adapt, create, craft, connect, suffer, sometimes survive, and sometimes not, amidst the conditions of a world that limits the opportunities for some while enhancing them for others. I did not understand what I was seeing until anthropology showed me that looking is not necessarily seeing, and seeing is not necessarily perceiving, and that perceiving as understanding, as illumination, is a central goal of my discipline, even if it falls short of reaching it. This is a most intense period for the world, given the material and political conditions of life in the first quarter of the 21st century. In an article published 12 years ago, I wrote, and I'm quoting myself, "We are at the dawn of a new century that seems to promise as much violence as occurred in the 20th century. People are afraid of annihilation and desire protection. Instead of providing protection, our world leaders are manipulating deeply felt fears, distorting these emotions for other ends. At this time, I fear to imagine the future," close quote. Little did I know how bad it would get. 10 years ago, American anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom wrote, quote, "The way we explain our todays creates our tomorrows. As true for people struggling to resist systemic structural violence as for us, scholars struggling to understand what is going on, why, and how the violence might be undone. We now stand amidst the state of a political world order with its crop of right-wing leaders from Trump to Erdogan, Netanyahu, Duda, and Orban, among others. How are we to understand our today? From my vantage point as a social scientist from the United States, the present-day world is hemorrhaging from ubiquitous war, poverty, economic and resource inequality, economic collapses, environmental crises, power abuses, and other forms of brutality and dehumanization, including the pathologies of xenophobia, racism, and sexism. The mass of humanity is managed, contained, and controlled by means of economic and ideological dominance, which is or can be enforced by violent means such as war, imprisonment, and outright displacement of people from their homes. If these observations are true, and I think they are, this is morally corrupt, inhumane, and unsustainable, a condition that has the potential to overwhelm the world, even as human beings everywhere manage within the interstices to engage what Ortner describes as, quote, everyday projects of care and love, even happiness, demonstrating the remarkable resilience of some kind of life force or energy. All this adds up to serious responsibilities for academics to participate in engaged scholarship, which the Carnegie Foundation in the United States defines as explicitly action-oriented. As one among various forms of knowledge production and dissemination, engaged scholarship seeks to provide solutions to social problems and to connect with larger publics. Brian Stevenson, an African-American attorney, offers a rationale for engagement. Decades ago, Stevenson established an organization in the deep American South called the Equal Justice Initiative. Its mission is to end mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, to challenge racial and economic injustice, and to protect basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. Stevenson urges everyone, scholars included, to get proximate to human suffering, which is the means by which individuals become inspired to contribute to positive social change that prioritizes human needs over other interests. To be proximate means getting up close and personal, because seeing things only from a distance leaves out important perspectives. Stevenson's idea of getting proximate relates to finding solutions to human and social problems. He urges a narrative shift that identifies love, not fear, not anger, as motive for social policy and practice. In times and situations of despair, he urges people to participate in making decisions, taking action, and finding solutions, even if it means going to uncomfortable places and doing uncomfortable things. Stevenson's message may make some scholars feel uncomfortable, even as it behooves us to implement it. For most US anthropologists and gender studies scholars, Stevenson's injunction is not new or unfamiliar. Many, if not most, scholars in these, as well as some other disciplines, recognize social injustice, which motivates them to study the causes and consequences of inequity. Such scholars have been trained to be present, to grapple with the horrors as well as the beauties of the world. More often than not, their scholarship is engaged, which may come in many forms and be practiced in different ways, and which also surfaces certain dilemmas and difficulties that must be worked through. Engaged scholars understand that detachment constitutes a form of action. To pretend otherwise is to ignore the fact that distance and distancing is not at all neutral, but has consequences. In dark times, this becomes especially pointed. Detachment is a form of complicity with the policies, practices, and ideologies that harm the most vulnerable in our midst. At its core, engaged scholarship means working to understand those dynamics with an eye towards ameliorating the problems and ameliorating the suffering. Engaged scholars ask, what can my discipline offer the world in order to address a wide range of issues of profound public importance? In the remainder of this talk, I will consider the power and promise of engaged scholarship by invoking Hannah Arendt's ideas and observations and others about her work, and through a discussion of our responsibility as academics to be introspective, to think in dark times, to avoid the trivial, and to participate in envisioning an alternative world. In her book, Men in Dark Times, Arendt plotted the lives and careers of various poets and political philosophers amidst terrible violence. Bertolt Brecht's intellectual and political biography is at the center of the book, which borrows its famous title from the dramatist's poem To Posterity. As Arendt explained, the poem is about those who live in dark times, Brecht's phrase, who ate between battles and slept among murderers, where speech betrayed them to the slaughterer and led those who remained to offer an urgent pleas, remember us with forbearance. Arendt remembered Brecht with forbearance, though she also acknowledged his particular lapses in judgment in failing to forcefully speak out against Stalin and his murderous actions. What sets Brecht apart from the others, she argued, is his consciousness and admission of the absurdity and decadence of personal progress and ambition alongside the suffering of others. The situation is Brecht's Germany of the 1930s, and Arendt described the poet's acuity, and here is a quote. He realized how deadly ridiculous it would be to measure the flood of events with the yardstick of individual aspirations, to meet, for instance, the international catastrophe of unemployment with a desire to make a career and with reflections of one's own success and failure, or to confront the catastrophe of war with the ideal of a well-rounded personality, or to go into exile with complaints about lost fame or a broken-up life. What of us, then, as scholars in these times? How will we pass the time that is given to us on earth? Each of us must confront our own motivations, beliefs, prejudices, and commitments before moving into the realm of academic vocation. Operating in the world as it exists, not as we might want it to be, those who become scholars must come to terms with the contradictions they will inevitably face. Considering we are here in this world and at this time as intellectuals affiliated with academic or other equivalent institutions, and considering our roles and responsibilities in them, we must recognize that we are all subjects who operate within the logics of the larger system. Whether it is comfortable to admit, this means that certain of our actions and activities contribute to the production and reproduction of the status quo. To be introspective is simply a call to acknowledge in the first instance that no one is outside the absurdity of individual aspiration as long as they are living in this world. Those who are comfortably settled into aspirational goals only must come to see the decadence. Those who imagine they are outside the absurdity must own up to the advantages they enjoy from it. The responsibility here is the unmasking of self-delusion necessary to the act of becoming or being a scholar who is honest. We will still make mistakes, but with the honesty that comes with introspection, we are more likely to be remembered with forbearance. The American political scientist Roger Berkowitz explains that Arendt's notion of the darkness is that which is hidden in plain sight. There are the tragedies to which Brecht refers in To Posterity, written on the eve of the Second World War in 1939, and those that came after, including genocide, the purges, and more war. Arendt's concern with catastrophes and their human toll tended to focus on how these could come to be in the first place, and she held the conviction that by understanding this, which is necessary but insufficient knowledge, the will to resist, her words, might be perfected. All the terrible things, the hunger, massacres, slaughterers, were real enough, Arendt observed, and took place in public. There was nothing secret or mysterious about it, although not easy to perceive. Thus, a central question follows: how can horrors appear in public discourse and yet remain hidden? Arendt offers this explanation. It was covered up, not by realities, but by the highly efficient talk and double talk of nearly all official representatives who, without interruption and in many ingenious variations, explained away unpleasant facts and justified concerns. The realities are out there, but light is required to see them. The basic physics of light applies equally well to the metaphor here. Without light, there is no seeing. This leads to the next question, which is centered on the processes required for illuminating aspects of reality. For Arendt, the key process is thinking, about which she offers the deepest reflections, the deepest of thinking, with implications for philosophy, history, and politics. She identified the absence of thinking to show the dangers of its lack. For example, Arendt insisted that Adolf Eichmann's most notable characteristic was his thoughtlessness. She insisted that thinking is not reasoning, which makes sense, as Berkowitz explains, quote, "Reason reasons, it does not think. The normalization of terror and torture shows how ordinary men can reason themselves into justifying what ought to be unthinkable. To assert faith in reason in the face of its rampant violation is to ignore the facts of our times. A person thinks by means of a soundless, solitary, internal dialogue, whereby he examines what he says and what he does, something akin to conscience, a silent intercourse that some people never initiate." Arendt observed that the inability to think is an ever-present possibility for everybody, scholars included. It is not enough for engaged scholars to be social critics, though that role is essential to exposing the realities that are hidden in plain sight. It may even be that the ability to critique is more likely to be found among thinkers, though not necessarily. For those in my discipline of anthropology, it may also be that its central method of ethnography is helpful in facilitating the process of thinking, in contrast to hurried, purposeful activity. The slow pace of participant observation gives a chance for things to reveal themselves in their secret meaning and experience at the sensual level, the meanings of which unfold later to invoke Wolf again. For Arendt, thinking always has the potential to be politically relevant. As she remarked, it was for herself, and I quote Arendt here. Whenever I transcend the limits of my own lifespan and begin to reflect on this past, judgment, and this future, forming projects of the will, thinking ceases to be a politically marginal activity. The responsibility to illuminate requires thinking in dark times. And thinking in dark times requires scholars to grapple with their own consciences, to refuse loyalty to any rigid ideology, doctrine, or dogma, and to find new ways to make sense out of the situation. It is only then that they may offer something creative to the world. In a powerful essay titled A Lying World Order, Deception and the Rhetoric of Terror, philosopher Peg Birmingham details Arendt's engagement with the problem of deception, which opens the door to the possibility of a lying world order and even the threat of totalitarianism. There are falsehoods and errors that are not truth, but they are also not lies. There are truths of reason. For example, a square has 4 sides, and factual truths, the latter of which Arendt argues are contingent. That is, the unfolding of reality is not inevitable. 2 dangers lurk around the political facts of lying and truth. One is the danger of conflating opinion with truth. Birmingham writes, the best way to destroy factual truths is to reduce them to so many opinions which can then be easily dismissed as just another opinion open to dispute, contest, and interpretation. The logical extension of this danger is pervasive. I have seen it in my classroom, sometimes in interpersonal conversation, and of course, on the US national political scene with the blatant truth and trust-busting absurdity of alternative facts promoted by the Trump administration. The second is what Birmingham calls radical deception, which goes beyond the deliberate lie to, in Arendt's words, add a new variation to the old art of lying, that of lying the truth. The deliberate conversion of a lie into a reality. Both Arendt and Birmingham offer examples. From Arendt, the Nazis destroyed Germany to show that they were right when they said the German people were fighting for its very existence, which was, at the outset, a pure lie. They instituted chaos in order to show that they were right when they said that Europe had only the alternative between Nazi rule and chaos. From Birmingham, the George W. Bush's administration's claim that Al-Qaeda is operating out of Iraq, which at the outset was a lie, used to justify the invasion of Iraq, but now, because of the war, is a true statement. For Arendt, the blanketing of public space with pointless trivia is purposeful political deception, originating with and spread by the system, as she put it. Because it camouflages, trivia functions like a lie because it hides something by pretense, affectation, or exaggeration. It is not necessarily equivalent to the deliberate lie or the political lie, and it is not radical deception. But it shares with those forms of lying the result, which is distortion. and distortion makes it difficult to distinguish between truth and a lie. Since scholars are not separate from the system but are deeply embedded in it, we have a responsibility to avoid producing and disseminating trivia. This is sometimes easier said than done, given that scholars are trained in and taught to celebrate a particular canon, some parts of which may not be particularly noteworthy, and which makes it difficult for other, perhaps more important voices to rise out of obscurity. Then there are the pressures to prove one's worth, which for those in the academy today, at least in the United States, sometimes means dismissing others to demonstrate one's originality, and generally means producing more material, not necessarily better knowledge. There is also the challenge of sorting through the clutter of one's research to pull out what is significant and knowing why it is so. I trust I am not alone in struggling with these issues or being disturbed by what sometimes seem like perfunctory exercises that yield the obvious or simply empty abstractions. So what is it we need to know in these dark times? For me, it is to understand the driving forces behind the horror, the moving parts of power and its relevant elements, and which strategic projects of the will need to be formed to oppose it. For as long as the world keeps going, ours is a constant and persistent challenge to connect those parts of the past that are responsible for shaping the present and to expose power by means of evidence, argument, and narrative. No trivial task. It is no accident that I invoke Hannah Arendt at this moment and as a citizen of the United States, I can barely say it. Still the most powerful nation in the world, not least in terms of its military might. I am not alone among Americans in turning to Arendt for guidance in these dark times. Sales of her books are reported to have skyrocketed in the United States since the November 2016 election, reflecting worries about the slippery slope of ideological racism, mass incarceration, the denial of reality, lying the truth alongside attacks on the media, ever-present and ever-growing militarism, hyper-nationalism, and enforced oblivion of over 65 million refugees worldwide. Arendt's scholarship on power was centered on its political dimensions. For her, the power that makes human beings superfluous, that transforms them into something less than human, is by her definition radical evil, which is rooted in particular systems. Of course, Arendt was focused on the system of totalitarianism and its manifestation in Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. Arendt also wrote about human attachment as a form of fraternity or recognition of a common humanity. From her standpoint, Arendt observed that humanity manifests itself in such brotherhood most frequently in dark times. It appears historically among persecuted peoples and enslaved groups. Thus, human attachment is not a natural affinity, but for her is the great privilege of pariah peoples, the outsiders. She had no faith in Enlightenment ideals, which to her look, and I quote her here, look like reckless optimism in the light of her present realities. Even so, Arendt never fell into melancholy, and she saw possibility in a process of mutual understanding on a gigantic scale. Those are her words. Arendt might not have joined these various strands of her philosophies in a single paragraph. I do, because I recognize that put together, they connect with those scholarly projects that identify the material substructure of any political economic system that exacerbates inequalities, renders some humans redundant or superfluous, and turns certain groups into pariahs. Scholars may not be of the pariah peoples, but the holistic study of humankind constitutes a starting point for a multitude of projects that comprise a rich store of knowledge produced by scholars from all over the world about humanity, anywhere and everywhere. It is from within that collective body of knowledge that we can offer illumination to the world. It contains the specificities across geopolitical space and over time that precludes the premature coming to broad generalizations that Arendt warned against. It contains the details that allow us to identify patterns, similarities, analogies, and precedents, so that we may be alert to the direction in which the world may be heading without jumping to mistaken conclusions. It contains the raw material for a process of mutual understanding on a grand scale. That's the promise and power of engaged scholarship. And engaged scholarship is our responsibility. On the last pages of the book, Upside Down, a primer for the looking glass world, the Latin American writer Eduardo Galeano dares readers to exercise the right to dream. Suppose we rave a bit, he writes, and he offers a long list of possibilities for an alternative world. A student introduced me to this book, bringing it to class one day and asking if we could also rave a bit. We did, writing down our ideas for this world and for a livable future, placing them on scraps in a jar. One by one, we lifted the slips of paper, reading aloud one another's vision. Each was generous, creative, and thoughtful, a small but perhaps necessary step in helping all of humankind move past the horrors and towards universal liberation, as anthropologist Roger Lancaster recently described what the world needs now. Knowledge moves forward by challenging convention, committing to engaged learning, and connecting with larger publics, an affirmation of the value of academic disciplines such as anthropology with its holistic orientation and gender studies with its intimate relationship to activism and scholarship. At stake is not just the past or the present, but the future. Once again, I return to Carolyn Nordstrom's words. The way we explain our todays creates our tomorrows. So how do we explain our today? At the broadest level, I understand that the sorry state of the world is rooted in the logics of the global capitalist political economy, marked by increasing privatization, marketization, and deregulation, which maintains conditions of scarcity and insecurity while protecting private, concentrated wealth, the driving force, the crux of the problem. Powerful ideological scripts justify draconian policies and ever-growing inequalities. The deployment of racist expressions and actions, the strengthening of ethnic nationalisms, and the intensification of religious bigotry help manage discontent, obscure structural inequality, and contain in relatively controlled settings those who have been made superfluous, the very definition of Arendt's radical evil. What is to be done? From my vantage point, I believe there is much that scholars are already doing and much we can continue to do, acting within the interstices to effect small-scale change. The world cannot afford scholars to be aloof from the great issues of our times. It is essential they actively contend with them. Most important, we need to see one another as collaborators, in solidarity with common goals, even if we disagree on certain points or tactics. In these dark times, it is essential that we stand together. Scholars in the fields with which I am most familiar, that is, US anthropology and gender studies, still struggle with a perception that they are not influential enough to shape the course of future social conditions and events. Perhaps it is pure aggrandizement to imagine such scholars have any power to shape the future. I say that believing in our own marginality seems a safe retreat that masks our privileges and too easily relieves us of responsibility. The history of my core discipline is replete with examples of anthropological data and methods being central, not marginal, to social policy and action. And as anthropologist Eben Kirksey recently remarked in a personal conversation, we do contribute to making concrete, if molecular, changes to policy against a backdrop of seeming impossibility. For scholars everywhere, our greatest contribution lies in our collective ability to lift the protective cotton wool to peek at some real things, out of which might the will to resist be perfected. We explore, uncover, translate, interpret, and explain, thereby making the world visible. We write histories in the process of being made. We are at our best when we look, see, and perceive with honesty and in good conscience, avoiding the trivial while working towards the great purpose of mutual understanding on a gigantic scale. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to hear the decision of Academic Council of the Ilia State University.
Oh my goodness.
Honorary doctor.